Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit about Final Fantasy, the original Final Fantasy on the NES, which I got to play through this month on stream, and I had a blast doing that, partly because I think the game holds up as far as its gameplay goes. It's still pretty fun, but I also had a great time just interacting with the chat and talking to you guys each night. So thank you for joining me if you hung out on any of the streams and made that just an extra fun experience. It was great to have a little bit of nostalgia with this NES game, but also really good to talk to people about all the crazy topics that we got to talk about. I thought it would be good to take some time and do a full analysis and reflection on the game, talk about what things I think really hold up and are still really good, as well as which version of the game you might want to think about playing, whether you want to play the original NES version or not. So first of all, when you are looking at the original Final Fantasy, one of the things that becomes apparent is that the emphasis is on the gameplay rather than the story. The emphasis on a very tight narrative or epic narrative experience really comes a little bit later in the series, and for the first game, the focus is on the gameplay. Yes, there's a story, but there's really not much to it. The story exists mostly to shuffle you through various set pieces and to send you off to various areas of the world where you will face increasing challenges until you get towards the final challenges of the game. So really, this story exists to serve the nature of the gameplay, not really the other way around. By the time you get to, say, Final Fantasy IV, you have a real melding of the gameplay in service to the narrative that's quite different from how it was originally. So the gameplay in this original Final Fantasy game ends up being the template for the gameplay for pretty much all of the mainline games that follow it. On the micro level, you are fighting monsters. You're figuring out how to destroy a pack of monsters and strategizing how you're going to do that quickly and efficiently. On the macro level, you are making your characters stronger. They get stronger by killing monsters, which drops experience, which levels them up, increases their stats. You are getting them stronger by killing monsters, which drops gold. And you're using that gold or guild to buy new equipment and new spells, which makes your characters more powerful and more resilient. At the meta level, you're moving through the story, and the story really is shuffling you from one area to the next, increasing the challenge in the gameplay as you go until you get to the end and you have to fight chaos. That's JRPG gameplay in a nutshell, so if you enjoy that kind of gameplay loop, then Final Fantasy is going to be a game that has enjoyable gameplay. What I like about Final Fantasy, say, compared to other games in the series, is that it is really up to you what kind of classes you have in your party. In later renditions of the game, you end up with set characters in your party that have set abilities and set capacities. In this game, however, right from the beginning, you can choose what classes you want to bring. You could bring 4 fighters. You could bring, in my case, I did 2 fighters, a red mage and a white mage. You could do 4 black mages. You could do 2 black mages and a white mage and a fighter, or any combination you want, or 4 monks, which would be characters that don't use weapons and just punch everything. It's really up to you how you want to arrange your party for play, and I think this actually lends a lot of replayability to the game. If you've played through it once, you can play through it again, maybe with a more challenging party, maybe try out a different party that has a little bit different feel at the micro level, makes you have to use magic and manage your magic charges a little bit better. It's really up to you how you want to play the game. So I find that a really, really good thing, and it's too bad we don't get more of that in later versions of the series, but we do get a return to it in Final Fantasy XII when you're able to pick the classes of your characters if you're playing the Zodiac Job System version or the new remastered version. Now, there are a couple warts with the gameplay of the NES version. Particularly, there are spells which don't work. If you buy them, they simply will not have an effect, or they will have the opposite intended effect. There are spells that monsters cast which don't have the effect that you would think that they would have. And this is a little bit problematic because unless you are using some external resource like a guide, which is going to tell you which magic spells are bugged, you might end up buying them and not realizing that they don't work and trying to use them in combat and thinking that they might work and wondering why they don't. So that's a problem. There's lots of bugs still in the NES version that are like that. If you get any of the elemental weapons, they do not do the effect that you would think they do. So if you get the fire sword, you think it will be strong against, say, ice elementals. It is not. It doesn't really do anything other than its basic damage. And I think that's a programming error or something like that. And I think that's been fixed in later versions. So if you are choosing to play Final Fantasy and you don't want to have to deal with all of those bugs, I would suggest that you try out the iOS or Android version because it's going to have all of those things fixed. Another thing about the gameplay in the NES version is that you have to very accurately strategize how you're going to attack what monster in what order. Because if you kill a monster, let's say you have two fighters like I did, the fighter kills a monster, the other fighter is going to attack that monster, he just swings into midair. You lose that attack for that round. And this is, quote, fixed in later versions, but I don't really consider this a bug. I consider this a feature of the gameplay. That is, when you encounter monsters, you have to think about how many hit points the monsters have so you can efficiently distribute your attacks and magic spells in order to defeat them. This is something that I had to adjust to when I was playing the NES version of the game, and I just think it's a normal part of gameplay. It made me have to think a little bit more in depth about what kind of monsters I was facing rather than just spamming the attack button. So it's totally possible if you're playing the Android or iOS version to have an easier and in a lot of cases maybe more boring experience if you were to play with a bunch of fighters and just spam attack every round. You can push through the game that way and really not have to do a lot of thinking about what kind of monster you're trying to attack and when. So I actually like the swinging into midair. I think that's part of the original design, and I think it's okay for it to still be there. Now, another little wart in the gameplay of the original game is there is a significant difficulty spike about halfway through the game. Once you clear out Elfland and once you are able to leave the sort of circular landmass that you originally start in, you end up in a situation where you have an option to go to 3 different places. You can go to a Castle of Trials, you can go to an ice cave, or you can go to a volcano. Each of these has a similar difficulty, and that difficulty is a big step up from what you've faced prior to that, which means you have to either stop and grind, or you have to be very, very careful and very, very thoughtful about what sort of things you bring with you into the dungeon. And in general, I had a little bit of trouble with this, and I died a few times and had a few game overs. And that made me end up using save states a bit more. So if you're going to play the original NES version on an emulator the way I did, I do recommend you make some use of save states just to save yourself time. And of course, you should be using tints and things to save your game outside of dungeons so you don't have to walk all the way back. But the main thing is my characters were not strong enough to overcome the next challenge, and I had to stop and rethink about how I was going to overcome that challenge. This is part of the macro level of the gameplay, I guess. So I had to go level up my characters and grind a little bit to get them strong enough. Because definitely in the ice cave, you run into these groups of mages that look like little weird goblin things, and they cast a spell called Rub, and they can just wipe your party out in one round. Sometimes you get a pack of 4 of them, they all cast Rub, and all your characters die, and that's a game over, just like that. You have to walk all the way back to where you were and go all the way back through the cave, or you could just not encounter them. It's totally up to luck in that case, and so it's one of those cases where the curve for the difficulty gets very steep very quickly, and you have to readjust and think about what you're doing. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it is not a very smooth gradation of difficulty in that case. Now, if you imagine playing this, say, back in 1990 on your NES, this may not have been quite as much of a problem because the way the game is structured, you're going to be doing lots of exploring to try to figure out where things are. And through doing that exploring, you're going to encounter more monsters, and your characters are going to level up more and get stronger, which is going to make, say, going to the volcano or the ice cave, it's going to make it significantly easier just because you will have spent more time leveling your characters up through exploration. If you're like me and you have a general memory or an idea of where you're supposed to go, and you have people in the chat helping you know where to go, then you might be encountering these places a little bit too early. You may not have done enough exploration and enough leveling up in order to make that experience in, say, the volcano an easy one. Another thing I'll say about the NES version is the names for spells are often confusing and don't really let you know what that spell is going to do. The problem with this is that you're limited to 4 characters for describing the spell. So this is a localization issue. You have to figure out how to write that spell in with 4 characters. Why are you limited to 4 characters? Well, in the Japanese version, 4 characters, because Japanese characters use syllables rather than single letters, you can write more words in less space. So kuraga would be 3 characters, not 4, but you can't really write that in English in 4 characters. You have to think about how to describe that in a different way. So that leads to looking at a big list of spells where you're really not sure what they do at all. And you have to look up what they do either in the user manual, which is very extensive, or in some sort of external guide to figure out exactly what that spell does. Also helpful to have the external guide because some of the spells simply don't work at all, where you would buy it and use it and it wouldn't do anything. Now moving on to the story, like I said, there's really not much there. You begin the game in front of Corneria, you walk into the castle, you talk to some people, and you figure out that the princess has been kidnapped. Pretty straightforward fantasy quest at that point. You go into town, you buy some equipment, you go out and start fighting monsters on your way to the Temple of Fiends. The first boss is pretty easy. You kill him, you bring the princess back, and then the king builds a bridge to go to the next town. So you're not even really pulled into what the story is supposed to be. The setup for the story is that you are warriors of light and you have crystals, and you're going to use those crystals to restore some orbs, but you don't really have an origin for your characters. You don't really have a reason for those characters to be there. You're missing a lot of the more in-depth backstory that you get with later Final Fantasy games. But to me, it's okay. I feel like the story approach is actually very similar to, say, original Dungeons & Dragons, or maybe Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. If you played original D&D games, the emphasis is not on a strict narrative. Really, the emphasis is on the gameplay. So your module, if you are even playing that, you could make up your own area. It's really more about the map and the dungeons and how you progress through the dungeons and how you play and how you choose to overcome various scenarios rather than some story that you happen to be playing through. I think the emphasis on story really comes much later in the gameplay of Dungeons and Dragons. I think that's really like a 90s and 2000s thing where people are really thinking about Dungeons and Dragons as a story experience rather than a gaming experience. There is a story to Final Fantasy, but like I said, it's mostly there to push you through the various set pieces. As you go through various places, eventually you're able to restore different orbs, and eventually when you restore all 4 orbs, you are able to access the final level, which takes you back in time to fight the very first boss in the game, who is been transformed into chaos and says he can live forever in this time loop. And it's a little bit clunky, but it's fun. And so you beat him, and then there's a post-roll epilogue narrative before it says the end. It's a really, really simple story. I like to think of the story as being out of the way of the gameplay. That is to say, the story sets it up so that the gameplay has context, but then it gets out of the way of the gameplay and lets you just play. The other thing about the story is you have to discover a lot of it basically by talking to people. Rather than having the narrative told to you, you have to discover what the story is. And I actually appreciate this. I liked this a lot in CRPGs that popped up in the 80s, 90s, and onward, where you really had to figure out the nature of the world and what the story was by talking to NPCs, by interacting with the world, by discovering things. And that's really the case with this one. You have to talk to lots of different townspeople. Sometimes they have useful things to say, sometimes they have not so useful things to say. And from what they say, you have to piece together where you're supposed to go next, what you're supposed to do, maybe hints on what kind of things you need to do. This becomes a little bit tough later in the game, where you have to know, okay, I have to get something from this caravan, but I don't know what I need to get from the caravan. You find the caravan, you get a fairy bottle. Where am I supposed to take it? You have to figure out where to take it. Then at a certain point, you have to figure out where to get this robot cube. You have to go into a waterfall to get it. It becomes very difficult to find the information for where you're supposed to go next in this original version of the game. This is just sort of the nature of the game, which is why I recommend for a lot of people who've never played the game before, it's okay to use a guide or a walkthrough that tells you basically what the next step is. I remember using a guide for the original Final Fantasy way, 20 plus years ago, back on the Nintendo Entertainment System, because this stuff was not certain. This is also the case in games like The Legend of Zelda. What's the story of The Legend of Zelda? Well, it tells you the story in that role at the beginning of the game and in the instruction manual, and then you're pretty much exploring the world and beating dungeons. It's mostly about the gameplay. And kind of like The Legend of Zelda, in fact, The Legend of Zelda I think is actually worse than original Final Fantasy in this regard. You don't know where to go next. You have to do a lot of exploring, trial and error to figure out where to go. And so if you don't have a guide to help you, it becomes really, really difficult to progress in the game. That was definitely the truth about the original Legend of Zelda game. If you didn't have a game, it was tough to know where to go next. You had to have friends who'd played it or friends who had that Nintendo power to figure out where to go. Final Fantasy, it's actually easier than that, but it's still not exactly clear where you're supposed to go, what you're supposed to do next. That being said, it's really not all that different from most NES games. If you were to, say, play Zelda 2 or Dragon Quest or any of these other earlier fantasy games, it's pretty thin on the explanations for where you're supposed to go and what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to go about doing it. You have to figure it out by trial and error or talk to your friends or use a guide. So that's the reality of the story for the original Final Fantasy. There's not much to it. You don't really understand the context of what you're doing till the very end, nor do you really need to. If you think about the tabletop experiences maybe that Final Fantasy is drawing from in the late 80s, your story, like I said, was more about getting you into the gameplay. It was about supporting the gameplay. But at the same time, the story was open enough for you to maybe engage in some imaginative play. You get to choose your classes at the beginning of the game. Presumably, just like with Dungeons and Dragons, you would imagine the backstory for the character that you created. If you created an elf ranger, maybe you imagined he's from some certain forest and he has some experience that enables him to do what he does in the dungeons and while you're playing the game. Now, I want to say that growing up playing games like Final Fantasy, these games were very inspirational at the time that we played them. If you're watching the streams now, or if you play the original Final Fantasy now, you might find it a rather thin experience as far as story goes. You might think that there's not all that much there, but back in the day, these were very inspiring. They let us imagine a lot of things because they showed us, say, glimpses of other worlds that we could then really flesh out in our minds and imagine lots of details of. This was also the truth about Legend of Zelda too. It maybe looks very thin from the outside if you're playing it in 2021, but back in the 80s, it was a big deal, and it was very, very inspiring as far as me as a kid and inventing stories and things like that. So Final Fantasy, you see forests. You can imagine a land with forests. When you fight monsters, you see the forests in the background or the swamp, and you can imagine encountering monsters in the forest. You can imagine what these towns maybe looked like rather than a 2D tile set, what they would actually look like in real life. You could imagine what kind of town it would be and what the people would be doing. You could imagine the ruined towns or like ruined temples. Your mind really filled out these details where the graphics were very rough and the graphics maybe couldn't show a lot of detail. Your mind would then think of more imaginative things that would lead to that, kind of like a classic illustration would. Classic illustration doesn't show every detail, but rather shows the important details and allows your mind to really contemplate that and think about what it would really look like in real life. Another thing about the graphics on the NES is that it's remarkable how much detail the artists were able to put into the sprites and the environments, considering the limited color palette that they had to work with. The NES, I think, could technically only display like 13 colors at the same time. I think on paper it's 16, but because of some practical limitation, it's 13. That means that to draw a sprite, you maybe have only 3 colors to work with, like black, one color, and maybe one other color, and those colors are also shared by the character sprites, which means that you get even more limited colors when you realize like you have characters that are assigned for the black mage, white mage, etc. Those are colors you always have to work with, and then you have maybe 2 or 3 other colors that you can use in an encounter to show what the monsters look like. Despite those limitations, the monsters look really good. There's a lot of detail in them. They're able to definitely show what those monsters are supposed to look like and allow you to imagine higher detailed versions of them when you look at the sprites. Likewise, the music is very memorable considering the limitations of the Nintendo Entertainment System. The NES could only play, I think, you only had 4 different sounds to work with for music. You had like a noise channel, you had like a square wave, a sine wave, and a triangle wave. And those were the voices you had to work with. So in most cases, you could only make a 3-voice melody. And despite that, the music is really good. Nobuo Uematsu created some of the most memorable themes, not just in the Final Fantasy series, but in video games in general. All of these different themes end up making a comeback in later games, whether it's the victory theme, or it's the theme that you see with the opening credits after you beat the first dungeon, which returns in several games and is the credits theme for Final Fantasy XII even. So you can't really underrate the contribution that Nobuo Uematsu did to the series and to this game by making such memorable music. So overall, I think despite the flaws and some of the warts with the NES version, I think Hironobu Sakaguchi, the original director of Final Fantasy, was able to pull off a game that has really managed to stand the test of time because of the quality of gameplay, quality of graphics, and of course, the music. If you are a younger player and you've never played the NES version, and you really want to see where things began and how really a franchise was able to develop despite those flaws, I think it's worth checking out the NES version. For people who are wanting a more smooth and maybe better aesthetic experience, I think one of the later ports is probably going to be a better choice. You won't have to deal with confusing spell names, you won't have to deal with bugged spells or bugged items, and you won't have to deal with some of the little localization issues that existed on the NES. My understanding was the localization was done very, very quickly, and of course it's not going to be as clear as things were in the original for some of the reasons I talked about. Limited space to produce dialogue. In fact, there's one part where when you are talking to the final boss, he steps back and back and back because the game was programmed to only be able to show one window of dialogue per character. So he's actually backing up and reappearing so that he can have multiple windows of dialogue. Lots of little creative things to get around the limitations in the game, but you don't have those limitations in later versions. Later versions are also going to have updated visuals with full color palettes that are a little bit more in line with the later entries in the series, as well as better orchestrations of the music because you're not limited to, say, square and triangle waves. I think either way that you want to play this game can yield a good experience, though I would tell people that it's okay to use a guide if you get stuck. Things were just not as clear and easy to communicate in the Nintendo Entertainment System world as they are with modern systems. As far as ports go, I can recommend the iOS and Android version. I have it. I've played through it. Last time I played through it was years ago at this point on a couple of long plane trips, but it entertained me all the way through, and I had a lot of fun playing the game, and I think it's really fun to come up with different kinds of parties to play through the game if you're bored and just want to do a little bit of JRPG playing. The PlayStation 1 version, which was from, I think, Final Fantasy Origins, it has Final Fantasy 1 and 2, is a very good updated version if you have a PlayStation or access or way to play PlayStation games. It has a reimagining of the visuals that are still pretty faithful to the original, updated music and those sorts of things. And that's also a good version of Final Fantasy II to play. You can also play the Dawn of Souls version for Game Boy Advance. I haven't really played it. I have a friend who played it on his playthrough this month, January 2021, and he really liked it. It has an updated script, so the script is a little bit clearer and makes the game a little bit easier to play through. And it also has most of the updated visuals, but because you're on a Game Boy Advance or you're playing a Game Boy Advance emulator, it's going to be a little bit lower resolution than the PlayStation version. So the newest version, the iOS and Android version, is probably a really easy one to get, and it's going to yield a really good experience for you. If you are looking at more older systems, I would take a look at the Game Boy Advance or the PlayStation version. Game Boy Advance one also, I think, has some extra dungeons on it if you want some extra challenges, a little bit extra gameplay compared to the original NES version. The time it takes to play through the game will vary considerably. I took a lot of time to play through the game on stream, mostly because I was spending a lot of time in chat. If I was just playing by myself, it would probably take a lot less time to play through the game, somewhere in the area of 10 to 15 hours if I was just exploring casually and not using a guide or anything like that. The world record, I think, is like 3 hours. So if you really know what you're doing, then it's probably less than a 10-hour game, which is a pretty good sizable experience for most people, but certainly not so long that you would feel like you're being ground into the dust by this super long RPG experience. Frankly, there's not enough story to justify a game that would be 20 plus hours long anyway, although I imagine I spent more time than that playing the original because I didn't know where to go, and you spent a lot more time grinding and leveling up on the NES. That was just the nature of the time. So like I said, if you're playing it on the NES, I think it's okay to use save states and a guide to kind of push you through those areas a little bit more quickly so it doesn't become an overly long and drawn out experience. So that's my analysis of the original Final Fantasy game. I still think it's worth playing in 2021, and I think it's worth playing the NES version so you can see where everything began and how people in my age group got really inspired by this Final Fantasy thing, this magical other world that we got to explore and interact with. Even though it's very, very mild as far as the detail goes compared to a modern game, I think that actually helped us imagine more than we would imagine with modern games. It was very inspiring to play these old fantasy games back in the 80s and 90s. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.